You may have seen some of these cheap, pre-made emulation boxes on sites like Amazon, and a lot of them really aren't bad for what they are. The games are already loaded, it's supposed to be plug and play, and you get to do a lot of retro emulation. You shouldn't have any problem whatsoever with systems like Sega Genesis and SNES. Maybe even some PS1, depending on which box you have. But maybe that's grown a little stale and you've tried to move on to some of the more demanding stuff. Tried being the key word. Some of these devices on the higher end can be pretty solid, but can cost $200 to $300. For the boxes that are in the $40 to $70 range, or some that can be found for as low as $30, when you get into some of the PS1 and N64 games, you might find the performance lacking. And a lot of the games might not even be playable. On top of that, adding your own games for consoles like PS2 or GameCube is pretty much out of the question. And upscaling PSP games is usually a no-go as well, again, depending on which box you have. You may be ready to angrily throw the machine at the wall, or employ the standard pool noodle method. Now, this video is for educational purposes only. Do not attempt. But, hypothetically, if you feel like you're tired and done with one of these types of boxes, there may be another option. Maybe it's time to harvest the soul of the machine. And by that, I of course mean the SD card, which doesn't sound quite as dramatic. Essentially, your entire system is in this card. Usually, the operating system, the emulators, all of the games, all being loaded from this micro SD or SD. And on a lot of the boxes, you can just pop this card right out of the system. And one thing I wanted to try was to take the card out of the emulation box, put it into an office computer, and see if I could boot directly from the card itself. But I had no luck with this, even when messing around in the BIOS and trying a bunch of different things. It might be possible, but I couldn't find a way using that method. I'm guessing this is because there are different variations of the operating system for different boards and computers. Since that didn't work, the other possible solution is a little more complex. Now, I can't recommend you do this because only you know what you're comfortable with and what you're trying to do. But for entertainment and educational purposes, this method involves transferring the data from the pre-built emulation box to your own emulation system if you've built one or want to build one. When I do emulation, this is typically how I approach it. I create a standalone system using Batocera. Batocera is a free-to-download operating system based around emulation that's awesome in a lot of ways. And I have to say, I have a lot of respect for people who work on those types of passion projects. Essentially, Batocera is a distro of Linux. You can download an ISO from their website and then flash to an SSD or a USB drive. If you aren't familiar with that process, there's a lot of info generally online about that as well. But to briefly touch on it here, what I've done for my main emulation computer is flash the Batocera ISO to a 2.5-inch SSD and then put that SSD into an old Office PC as the only operating system. Now the cheap Office office computer serves as a standalone emulation PC, a pretty capable one at that. But if you wanted to run the Batocera operating system without having an old cheap PC laying around to convert, the other option, as mentioned previously, would be to flash the Batocera ISO to a USB drive instead of a 2.5-inch SSD. The performance won't be as good, but this will create a drive you should be able to boot from on most computers, which for the example is what I'm doing right now. Using a program called Rufus to flash the Batocera operating system onto a USB drive. After that, I'm going to put it into a standard Office PC that would typically boot to Windows. This may vary depending on what computer you have, but if you have Secure Boot disabled and USB boot enabled in the BIOS, you should be able to pop that USB drive into any computer, mash escape during startup, or whichever key brings up the boot menu on your PC, and then select the USB option from the boot menu. If all has gone well, you should be able to boot into the Batocera operating system like I have done here. Once again, there's always some level of risk in doing things like removing the SD card from your emulation system. For example, if you have any kind of warranty, it may void it. So, as always, I'm here to entertain, not advise. But if you hypothetically have an SD card from one of these pre-built boxes, but have already made your own system, you could boot up your system, in this example, booting from the Batocera USB flash drive. And at this point, there really wouldn't be anything on Batocera, but you could take the SD card from your pre-built and insert it into the new running system. This may require some kind of adapter, like micro SD to SD, or in this example, micro SD to USB. You could insert this SD card into your computer, and then with a keyboard plugged into the same computer, press the F1 key to bring up the file system. Now we're in the Batocera file system, and at this point, there's two things we need to get our games going. I'll need some BIOS files, and I'll need some ROMs. There's nothing in the individual ROMs folders at this moment because, like I said, we're just running the base version of Batocera. But the SD card from the pre-built emulation box should have the files I need. When you insert the card, either through SD card reader or a micro SD to USB adapter like I have, the SD card should show up near the bottom of the file explorer on the left-hand pane. The name will vary depending on what you put in there, but it should be in this general area. Now you can navigate through the files of the SD card to look for the things that you need. And if the SD card came from one of these pre-built emulation systems, then hypothetically there would be ROMs inside of those folders. And now in this case, the SD card only has my own ROMs dumped from games that I own, with files designed to mimic the file structure of one of those boxes. But you of a more rebellious nature, you could find the ROMs from your pre-built system and you could easily copy them from there. Copy from the SD card, navigate to the relevant folder of our Batocera system, and paste into that relevant folder. Making sure not to accidentally remove any files or to do this backwards. Copy from the pre-built SD, paste into the new Batocera system. You could hypothetically do this for the ROMs and all the contents of the BIOS folder. copy from the SD BIOS folder and paste into the new system BIOS folder. Then if you exit the File Explorer view and go back into the primary system, you should be able to press start and check this menu for the Update Game List option. If done correctly, this should make all the games visible and playable. Now again, I'm using my own stuff for this demonstration, but if you followed along properly, you would have copied all of the soul of the machine from your so little game box and pasted everything into your new emulation machine made from a cheap office PC or your main computer. A computer that likely has a much more powerful processor, better graphics, and a larger amount of RAM that's typically faster as well. And depending on the specs, you shouldn't have any issues with games that had trouble running on the Prebuilt. For the system I used in this example, we are held back a bit by the speed of the USB drive. As I mentioned before, the main way that I emulate is on a standalone PC with an SSD. For example, my primary emulation PC that I've used for a long time has an i3-4130, which is a pretty old processor. The entire PC only cost $50, and it does PS2 and GameCube with no issues whatsoever. I will emphasize again that this video is for entertainment purposes. Don't be like me. And thank you for watching.